hello again. Another donation that I only received, was it last night? What day is it? Friday? Yeah. It was dropped off last night by a gentleman that lives in the village where I live, who I came across last year. I did a whisky tasting for my daughter's school as a charity fundraiser, and he was one of the guests there. I think that we ended up with about 12 people there, but fortunately still managed to raise 250 quid for my school, which I was really, really pleased with. I can't even open the damn thing. And he was there. He ended up, because there was only 12 people that had paid tickets, there was half a bottle left of the various whiskies that I put on, which had been brilliantly donated by a number of people, particularly Ollie Chilton at the Whisky Exchange. And I ended up basically auctioning the rest of them off, essentially saying, right, there's half a bottle left, it's worth 30 quid, there's half a bottle, who'll give me 15 quid, anybody want to give me 20? And it just all went into the pot for the school. So a guy called Jim Urquhart was there, who ended up, I think he bought the remainder of the Glenfiddich 21-year-old, and it was a nice chunk to go into the donation for the school. So he found out about the challenge through Facebook, and he was up in Scotland last week. So he stopped off at a shop called the Whisky Castle, which I had never heard of. It's in a place called Tomintoul, and I think that they may have actually donated some miniatures. I've got 5 miniatures from him, and I think it's from. In fact, I've got a card of it over here. So, if they did donate, if Jim wasn't daft enough to actually buy some miniatures to go towards the challenge, but if these guys at the Whisky Castle, where's the camera? I'm not sure if you can see that, whether we'll actually get the. Trying to get the light, there we go, because it's slightly sparkly. So the Whisky Castle, Sam and Scott Ashforth at Tomintoul in Moray. If you did give those miniatures to Jim last week, really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. So the first one that I'm going to have is more because of what I've just found on the label, which gives me an inroad into talking about something else, and it is this one, which is called Glentauchers. This is what the bottle looks like full size, and it looks to be discontinued. So I did find it selling on Amazon for 63 quid. Now I think it was selling for cheaper than that, but Amazon have been selling. I've got a miniature of a 14-year-old Oban, which is from about the 1960s, I think, and they're selling one for 200 quid. So Amazon pricing I would take with a rather large pinch of salt. Anyway, Glentauchers is a Speyside distillery that was built in 1897. Now, it was a gentleman called W.P. Lowry who funded another guy called James Buchanan, who at the time was a very big whiskey blender. And he had Buchanan's blend and was also responsible for the black and white blend as well, which is very, 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 still very popular in mainland Europe. Now, because of financial difficulties in the years just after it opened, Buchanan ended up essentially getting ownership of the distillery as a whole, and it was used predominantly for blends. It was a malt whiskey machine for going into the blends, which we're selling a lot more of. It was mothballed. It eventually changed hands as all of these do, and it was owned by United Distillers, a company that became part of Diageo. But they mothballed the distillery in 1985. It was then bought by Allied Distillers in 1989 and reopened. And through various mergers, acquisitions, blah, 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 it's now owned by Chivas Brothers, which is part of Pernod Ricard. 99% of the malt whiskey that comes out of this distillery goes into blends. Ballantine's, Teachers and Chivas Regal. So there isn't an official bottling of it. There sort of was a semi-official bottling at the turn of the century, kind of 2000, that I think was a 15-year-old, but it was very inconsistent in terms of the actual release, and it wasn't an official bottling. And it's one of these where, because the market for blends is so big and they need so much of it to go into the mix, essentially, that they don't need to release it as a single malt because they know it's going to sell as a blend. That Ballantine's is going to sell and Teachers is going to sell. So why bother taking some of that stock away to sell as a single malt that might not sell when you know that it's just going to sell like Billio? So it's difficult to get hold of Glentauchers, so I really appreciate Jim being able to get hold of it. And what made, now I've got a sample of a Glentauchers 13-year-old from Chris Cook. So apologies, Chris. I'm putting that one aside, and I'll stick it on the back burner in case I need it later on in the challenge when I run out of donations. But the reason I'm using this one is because, now it is just on the miniature, because I've looked at the picture of the full-size one, and I'll put that back up in a minute. But this one has got distilled 1991. Not sure where it's going to pick that up. So it says on the label distilled 1991. Nowhere on here does it then say when it's bottled. Now on the full size, if I put it back up, you'll notice that basically on the top of the neck there's a separate little sticker, just kind of there on that picture, which says bottle 2007. So we can now say it's a 16-year-old. But this is one of those little things where sometimes you'll come across bottles in not unscrupulous independent bottlers, but sometimes you'll find bottlings where they're wanting you to not realise how old it is or think it's older than it is. And one way of being able to do that is essentially to make it a vintage. So this is saying this is a 1991 Glentauchers. Now if you're not aware of the fact that whiskey only matures in the cask, so you think it's like wine where it matures in the bottle as well, you might be thinking, wow, I've got a 1991 Glentauchers here and it's 2016, so this is now a 25-year-old. Is that right? Yeah, 25-year-old. I've got a 25-year-old Glentauchers here. If I keep hold of this for another 5 years, it'll be a 30-year-old. Now, not everybody thinks that way, because quite a lot of sort of regular whiskey drinkers know it's about the cask, but not everybody does. And it was a fairly common thing working in the whiskey shop, and my dad still says it every now and again before I have to remind him, that people would come in and go, oh, you know, I've got this Lefroy 10-year-old, but I've had it in my cupboard for 20 years, so it's a 30-year-old, how much is it worth? And it's like, well, it's still a 10-year-old Lefroy. There is some value on it in terms of the fact that it's an older bottling, in terms of the labelling and when it was made, and flavours can change over time in terms of their production, so it might taste different to the way that they're making it now. But it's not a 30-year-old, it's still only a 10-year-old. Once it went in the bottle, that's it. It's not really doing anything else. As long as your seal is tight and you're not losing anything through oxidation, then, you know, it is what it is in that bottle. It is a Lefroy 10-year-old. It still is. So it was just interesting to kind of see that and go, interesting, it doesn't say when it was bottled. How old is it? Now I've got to go and do some research. So it's a 16-year-old Glentauchers. So that was the reason for me using that, was just to kind of put that out there in terms of, if you weren't aware, whiskey doesn't mature in the bottle. Once it's in there, it does very, very little, if anything. All the maturation's in cask. So by having a vintage on it, you need, if it says 1991, you then need to find out when it was bottled to find out how much it is. This is not a 25-year-old Glentauchers. This is a 16-year-old Glentauchers that's been sat in there for 10 years. Okay? Cool. Right, let's do a quick tasting, because we're on bloody 8.5 minutes already. So 43%. Actually smells a little bit more. There's quite it's quite sharp on the nose, but there's a nice fruitiness to it. This is kind of a peary, appley, grapey fruitiness to it. Ooh, that's unusual. There's a lovely spiciness to it, but it's a real soft spice, kind of like soft nutmeg, and really, really almost like sweet cinnamon. Now that cinnamon toast crunch cereal, I love that stuff. It's kind of like that. It's got this tingliness of kind of sweet cereal, but this lovely soft spice feel. Cinnamon toast crunch is yeah, definitely the vibe I'm getting, and I love that stuff. So this is going down very well indeed. There's a little sharpness to it. There's an edge to it that is almost grainy. It's almost like a blended. And that second mouthful wasn't quite as well balanced as the first. almost as though the alcohol content is slightly overpowering the flavours, but it can't really be that because it's only at 43%. It's just slightly unbalanced. It just needs tempering slightly. It needs the edge rounding off, and to let that soft spice and that sugariness come through. But there is a background of nice sweetness, not really much smoke, if anything. So that's not coming through. It's very, very nearly a really good whiskey. Unfortunately, there's just too much of a heat to it, and a sharpness and an edge, and that kind of chewing on a piece of cask woodiness that comes through right at the end. The finish is really quite dry, and it's a shame because it starts off really, really well, really nice, and it just tips over the other way of too much oak, too much woodiness. The balance goes, and all of a sudden we're falling off the chair, and it's a bit like, oh, we're not really that good at whiskey after all. It's a shame. It's a real shame, because that first mouthful was absolutely cracking. Yeah, it's just a little bit too dry. It's such a shame because it starts off really, really nice. There's a lovely cinnamon, like a sweet cinnamon, kind of cinnamon bun type feel to it. And then all of a sudden this dryness and oaky, woody, kind of bare wood dryness just comes in, dries everything around your mouth. I really need some water now, just to try and get some moisture back into my mouth. And it finishes on a low. That is a whiskey of two halves, and unfortunately it's the wrong way around. If it started off dry but finished with that cinnamonness, I'd be loving it. I'd be absolutely loving it because you could get over that hurdle. Unfortunately, this hurdle's right at the last, and it trips you up and makes you fall flat on your face. Oh, that's a shame. That's a shame. That might be why they don't do an official bottling, because it needs to go in a blend, because as a single malt on its own, it's just not quite well balanced enough. And that's a 16-year-old as well. You know, that's had some decent time in cask. From what I gather, it's a first fill and refill sherry cask as well. So first filled sherry should give you even more sweetness, and I think that's where that nice sweetness is coming from. It's just this dryness really kicks through. Such a shame. Still, never mind. It was very nice to have. Jim, thank you for donating it. Chris, apologies. I will have that Glentauchers at some point, but it might be after the challenge ends, or you can have it back. But I need it to start with until I know that I've got the numbers. Right, that's it. I shall see you at the next one. Cheers.